This conversation took place with Professor Richard Bauer and Dr. Mark Swinbank in November 2016. Both Richard and Mark are based at the Institute of Computational Cosmology at Durham University, and I wanted to bring them together to form, along with myself, a three-way conversation about visualization in cosmology. There's a great deal of crossover between the work that Richard and Mark carry out, but there's also some fundamental differences, not least the fact that Richard works mainly with visual simulations constructed purely from data, whereas Mark works more with visualizations built from observational data. So I didn't want to polarise these two starting points of the observational on the one hand and the constructed on the other, but I was interested in how they played out in relation to some of the ideas central to photographic theory in my own field, like, for example, photography's indexical relationship to the world. So this idea of photography's connection to the real is threaded throughout our conversation, and it started here by Richard Bauer.
I mean, one of the really interesting things in our conversation that we had before that I really liked that emerged from that was this idea that how when I'm making these images or movies, I'm trying to be a photographer like you, but of course the fascinating thing is I'm not taking a photograph of anything that actually exists, right? So that the world exists as a set of numbers inside the computer, and then it's trying to turn just that set of numbers into something that you can then see. And in a sense, I'm trying to make a universe and then be part of that universe, even though it really doesn't exist. And I find that just fascinating, this that it's not real, and yet when you see the picture, it kind of is real, and you kind of try to get an experience of being in that universe. And that's both, you know, scientifically valuable, so you can see what's actually happening, how galaxies are being created. So I was at a meeting last week, and you know, you can try to talk about it scientifically and write down some equations, but that doesn't mean a lot. You then have to see the movie and go, oh, but we missed out this. You know, if I'm floating in my spaceship able to see this stuff. So that, and it also creates things that are incredibly beautiful, right? So it's like the ultimate landscape photography, but it's not a human landscape, it's a landscape inside the computer. Right. So I find that fascinating. Now, what's an interesting contrast is then trying to take photographs of the real universe and get a feeling for a picture for where we are in the real universe, so we can have telescopes and we can take pictures with the telescope. But how do you turn that from something that's just a flat image into something that you can almost touch and almost perceive what it's really like and what it's
and that's your area, Mark, yeah?
Much more so, yeah. I work much more on the observational side, taking pictures of very deep parts of the universe and then trying to make images, make colour images out of those, and then trying to interpret what I'm seeing in those colour images. I've always found it fascinating that the galaxies that we're looking at are often at the far edge of the universe, and they've been travelling across the universe for 12 billion years, and then you detect them with your telescope. You're looking back sometimes 90-something% of the age of the universe.
So the light set off from that galaxy just after
the universe came into creation. Yeah. And then we take those images and we try and interpret what might be going on in those very first stars, those very first galaxies, and try and work out. Ultimately, I'm interested in trying to understand, why did the sun form in the way it did in our galaxy? How did our galaxy, the Milky Way, form? Why did the sun form the way it did? Why do then stars and planets exist in the way they do? Because that process started so long ago, and so we try and trace the evolution of galaxies, and like our spiral galaxy, the Milky Way, all the way from its very first seeds 12 billion years ago all the way down to the present day.
Right.
The difficulty with, or the difference now, I think, between observations and theory, in observations you only ever get a single snapshot. You know, we're here for 100 years, 50 years, however, depending on how much you drink. You can't watch galaxies evolve. You can't sit here and watch how the Milky Way evolves over there, because that time scale is billions of years, certainly hundreds of millions of years, you know, vast time scales. So we only ever get it, as observers, you only ever get a snapshot of what's going on in the universe at one specific time. You can't sit there and watch how something evolves. The huge advantage of the simulations is you can do that with the simulations, and that's where they have a huge advantage. Because you run it in a computer, you can sit and watch a part of the universe in your simulation evolve.
Right.
And so trying to link, that's where I think the strongest links are between observations and theory.
Right.
Your simulation allows you to watch how things grow, how things evolve, and then you've got to try and match that to the observations. But on the observations you only ever have a snapshot.
So am I right in saying that your visualizations are extrapolated from that snapshot? So
I think the interpretation is extrapolated from that snapshot.
Right.
The data is the data.
Mm-hmm.
You take a picture, and then you try and interpret what's in that picture.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are different things that you can do to that picture in the first place. So you can try and interpolate in some way. Maybe you've got images at lots of different wavelengths. You can put different filters on your camera. Okay, you can take images in the infrared or in the optical, or maybe the same range that your eye sees, and you can interpolate those into different wavelengths and try and interpret or interpolate the data that way. But you've only ever got one snapshot.
Right. Okay. So I think something that's at the centre of this research is this idea of remoteness, and that in a way is what one of the kind of primary barriers to an imaginative connection for people. And when I'm saying this, when I'm speaking, I am, it's shorthand for lay publics. I'm not a scientist. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a lay public, and I think again, what interests me is this idea that historically, and I mean in kind of ancient philosophy, we were the measure of the universe. We and on our bodies, and the Vitruvian man was the way of kind of measuring, and that over the centuries, we've gone through the use of apparatus into the kind of macro, into the micro, into the kind of subatomic, and those kind of shifting either way in terms of scale has created this kind of remoteness that, especially in terms of cosmology, creates wonder. And so there's a lot of
but don't you think, man, as always, you've looked at the horizon and you've wondered, what would it be like to be in those mountains across there on the other side?
Well, absolutely, because I was going to say
there's always been that kind of remoteness.
Yeah, which is a lot to do with the idea of the sublime. That kind of remote, frightening but awe-inspiring kind of scale that we get a sort of sense of vertigo when we try and think about that. And that has happened in kind of culture and sort of painting and sort of landscape painting, especially kind of 19th century German painting and philosophy. But it's very much there in kind of cosmology, and increasingly in the sort of subatomic or genetic worlds where there are these kind of scales and bodies of knowledge that are kind of opening up seemingly every year for us to try and sort of get our heads around. So I suppose I'm interested in how this kind of remoteness has now been mitigated in some way through the kind of apparatus of science. So you're using either telescopes or spectrometers to kind of measure, and so thinking about how you use that to create these visualizations, and so Richard, you're saying about this relationship to looking, and of course with photography,
there's been this sort of debate about the idea of the real,
Yeah,
and that you're
exactly.
photographing something that actually is there, and you're probably aware of there's a lot of kind of arguments around this idea of indexicality, that somehow the photograph is an index of the world,
Yeah.
in a way that a footprint is a sort of trace that somebody has actually been there. And so a lot of the kind of controversy around digital photography is the fact that an image can now be made, you know, completely in CGI, and it never existed in the world.
Exactly.
So I suppose what I wanted to tease out was some of those kind of relationships in your field between the real and the constructed.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, isn't it? Right, that the at least in terms of the simulated images, is to try and give you an idea of what it would be like if it were real, right? To be able to fly in your spacecraft through the universe, to be able to put your dark matter glasses on and suddenly see everything around you. And at least my aim would be to give you that experience. Now, whether humanity will ever be able to travel these distances through the universe, you know, whether there's a warp drive that someone is going to discover, but quite possibly, if you believe all we know about physics, no, that man is always going to be stuck within our current galaxy, maybe explore a few nearby planets, but we will never actually travel through the universe, and we'll never see the universe being created. And yet we kind of can, because we understand enough about the laws of physics to be able to work out what happened. And then we can go and have that virtual experience. But like you say, it's a bit uneasy because it's not really what was there. So it's a manufactured photograph, but it's not like it's just my imagination that's created it. It's the laws of physics that have created this universe. So as far as I'm able to do, what I'm photographing is the real universe. It's just I have to use the laws of physics to make it again in order to have that experience. Now, it's then very interesting when you start taking photographs of the real universe through a telescope, how to give those that, say, meaning and realism. So I don't know if you want to explain how this works, Mark, because I think
so related to that, you could argue with this. So the image that Richard's got on screen here is the deepest image that's ever been taken. It was taken with the Hubble Space Telescope. So that's the Hubble Space Telescope was launched in the mid-1990s. Famously had those problems that the mirror was out of focus, and they went up and fixed it eventually. This is one of the deepest images that's ever been taken. It represents many hundreds of hours of observations, and it's in colour scale there, similar to what your eye would see. Now, just to give you some idea of scale, the image that you're seeing there, if you held a £1 coin up at arm's length, the size of that image would be approximately the same size as the Queen's eye in a £1 coin at arm's length. And that image contains about 5,000 galaxies, maybe a few more. And they're all different shapes and sizes and colours, and they're all at very different distances. Some of those galaxies on that image are, in cosmological terms, very nearby, and then some of them that don't really appear on that image because they're very faint are at the far reaches of the universe. And so we spend a lot of time trying to find the galaxies in those images, and then using their colours and their shapes and their sizes and their distances to interpret how galaxies form, how stars form inside galaxies, and then how galaxies evolve. But related to what Richard was saying about objects not being real in the simulations, the light from those galaxies set off hundreds of millions of years ago, sometimes, often many billions of years ago. So you take that snapshot, but none of those galaxies are actually there and look like that right now, because the light's been travelling towards us for many billions of years, and those galaxies will have changed in that time. And so that's always kind of fascinating, right? Because that's true of the light that you see from the sun. The light that comes down from the sun set off 8 minutes ago. I'm pretty sure the sun is the same as it was 8 minutes ago, but it's the same principle. The light that you're seeing from the sun isn't as the sun is right now. It has a finite speed. The speed of light is finite. But these galaxies won't be there in the way that you see them in this image. This is just a snapshot of how things were many billions of years ago.
So you're, in the way I'm thinking about it, and the way I think about my work, you're sort of opening up a kind of impossible space for us to be in, because you're putting time in that equation. You're allowing us to move through time.
That's
an
right.
image, which is impossible.
Yes.
Even if we achieve much greater distances in terms of space travel, we'll never be put in that relation to time.
Correct.
Unless we find some
way of going back in time.
Yes,
exactly. And if the current laws of physics are correct, then you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. So what's fascinating about this, though, is when we started trying to look at these images, the fascinating thing is the distances to the objects. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually fly through the Hubble Deep Field, seeing all the galaxies around you? But it turned out that was really rubbish, because all the galaxies are really tiny, really small. So we had to
artistic license when we make these movies. Yes.
To give you the experience in a human way, we had to make all the galaxies a little bit bigger and then put them back.
The distances between the galaxies are far, 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 far bigger than the actual sizes of the galaxies.
Right. So
and yet, when we play this movie, can we press play?
Yeah.
So this is a fly-through that we made this summer. I had a summer student doing this. So you're flying through. So we know the distances to these objects, or we think we know the distances. And so you can. Oh, there we go. It's actually come up with better resolution now. You can actually try and make a movie that flies through this very deep field. And these are nearby galaxies, some spiral galaxies that look like the Milky Way, some red galaxies because they contain lots of old stars. And then as you start to move further and further back, so here you're looking, by the time you get to now, the universe is about 13 billion years old now. You're now looking back in this image to a time when it was about half of its present age. So the images that are coming past us now, these are all before the sun formed. Okay, before the sun was even in existence, or the Earth was in existence. And the galaxies in here look quite big. We've made them a bit bigger, because if we made them their real size compared to the volume that you're flying through, they would just be pinpricks.
Right. Okay.
Which wouldn't be very interesting.
And you're saying you've also made it denser because.
No, this is the real data. We've just made the galaxy images appear bigger here.
Okay.
Otherwise, you would be flying through, and you just see little pinpricks.
Like the way when you look at a scene, your brain. I'm always disappointed when I try and take real photographs, because you go, oh, there's this really interesting castle. I take the picture, and you take the picture, and there's this little tiny dot, and you think, well, it was much bigger than that when I looked at it, right? And then you get your telephoto lens out, and you go, right, now I've got a nice big pic. And then where's the context? Where's, the glen that the castle is in? Yeah. And it's the way that your human interpretation of a picture, magnifies pieces up so they seem much bigger in relation to their context. Yeah. In the way it appears, right? So so you have this problem of trying to represent how things would seem to you in the universe if you were traveling through it again, to try and make this remote thing something that you could almost imagine experiencing and being there. So that's the aim of a lot of what we're doing, to take this very kind of abstract science, or this thing that's far away, and to give you an appreciation of its beauty. My analogy is being a Stone Age man and seeing the island across the water and thinking, oh, what if I could sail to that island and what would it be like over there. And it's the same kind of thing. I think it's a natural human thing to want to do.
Yeah, it's that classic curiosity, isn't
exactly.
Of kind of reaching. But I suppose because now we live in an age where we're saturated by CGI images, and we go and see films, and we're put in, you know, the middle of an explosion, you know, in a building or a car crash or something. There's a sort of a confusion as to this idea of the real and what we're looking at, and those kind of impossible spaces. And I think something that really interested me when I went to CERN was one of the things they were developing was their media lab. And they were very excited because they'd just employed somebody who came from a background of gaming to try and make better in inverted commas representations of what was actually happening in the detectors. And I was quite intrigued by that, because I was saying, well, do you think that is going to help people connect, or is it going to be placing it in the world of CGI, which in itself has that sense of removal, you know? But because it is one of our kind of challenges as we will go more and more towards virtual reality, is this sense of the haptic, of touch, of experience. And, and that was a very good description that you've just made of being in a glen and looking at a castle and having this experiential perception of the scene and the kind of limitations of photography, which will flatten that. You know, our eye. You know, I'm looking at you now. My eyes are focusing on outside, on inside. You know,
and it all
changing
together.
The aperture of my eyes the whole time. So that kind of simultaneity of experience is flattened down when we make a photograph of something.
But then a really good photograph that I don't manage to do, but Ansel Adams and things like this, you look at the photograph and you get that experience, and somehow the castle will seem huge, and yet you get the whole context by not in that case, you know, no trickery, but in the careful placement of the camera and the composition of the scene. Right.
Yeah, but I think even in Ansel Adams' time, which, you know, as you say, there was no Photoshop.
You can play with developing.
It was an optical capture of that, but then a very skillful manipulation in the darkroom of how the kind of relative values of something is actually printed. So in a sense, there was a kind of a manipulation of a sense of what that scene was for him, and that was why he was so kind of skillful. You know, now very little of what we would see in terms of a landscape, you know, the classic screensavers on maps are a great example where you get this, you know, Yosemite still, but they're highly sort of manipulated in terms of the kind of colour. And so, it intrigues me in your fields how much you're sort of thinking about these other problems of culturally how we perceive, you know, if these are conversations that you're having in terms of you know, because you described looking at the film and that aids the hard science, because there are things that you would see that you would not necessarily unearth through data.
Yes, that's
right. So you can say, oh, we're missing that, and you know, and it's really interesting to hear that you've made those decisions about the size of the galaxies, etc., on the deep field interpretations, because that must have been some kind of collective decision to say we're going to make this.
Pretty active.
Yeah.
Well, not. I mean, it sounds like
we didn't argue for a very long time exactly how big they should be. It was just obvious when we did it the first time that this wasn't going to work. And
well, sometimes, to be honest, you say you make a movie. It takes us a few hours to make one of these. It doesn't take very long. And you show it to Richard, and Richard will look at it and say, "Yeah, that looks good, but when I project it on screen, I won't be able to see any of them because we're giving a talk, the resolution, and we don't give talks in cinemas where you maybe can get that colour contrast. We give talks on project onto a whiteboard and with an audience. And he said that we need to increase the contrast or colour scale or size of the galaxy so that it projects well, so that I can use it at a conference. Now maybe if you're doing art, you'd say, oh, that image looks great on screen, but when I print it and somebody puts it on their wall, they're not going to see what I want them to see, and so you need to change the size, whatever, focal length, contrast, whatever.
Like I had that. There's the image outside the computer room. So frustrating. You look at it when it's actually printed, and you go, "Oh, where did all that dynamic range go?" That's right. And so even trying very hard to kind of boost the colours but not get them saturated, it is so hard.
We spend a lot of time just getting that colour scale right, just making them look just right on a projector.
It would be fascinating to kind of be able to spend the time in the dark room, like Ansel Adams presumably didn't just go in and go, oh, we'll just print it like this. But it's been a lot of experience and trials to develop the film and to get exactly the right exposures in the different places, like you were describing, to achieve, when printed, and maybe printed large, the impact you really wanted to capture from the scene is so time consuming to achieve that, even if you know what you're trying to achieve, and then it's very frustrating. And so for us, often, as Mark was saying, the problem is you actually want to be able to use this to show people in an auditorium, and then it's got to be ever so simple. And again, I think there's a lot more we could learn about composition of the structure of things that at the moment kind of happens randomly, semi-randomly, or just by going, oh, that looks good, but not really understanding what is the game going on here that makes it have an impact in a certain way. So I think there's a lot we can do yet more with that.
No, I think these are the things that I'm sort of interested in teasing out, because as I said to you when we spoke the first time, it may seem presumptuous, but I'm coming with my field of knowledge.
Well, exactly.
And you've got
that's why it's very exciting
field of knowledge,
about
and it's not about interpretation. It's about what happens between these to actually make something new, or to ask some questions that wouldn't ever come up.
No, we would never normally have a conversation like this. We'd just go, "What do you think of that?" And Mark would go, "No, let's do it like this."
Can we change it? Can we make that more colourful?
It's clear you haven't got the resources to dedicate to that.
Unfortunately
really
not.
Pushing
all of these, the ones, the images I'm showing you in the movies. I get a summer student to come in for 5 or 6 weeks and work and make the movies. Actually, making the movies is easy. I can make a movie in an hour, but getting the colour scale right, and the contrast right, and the backgrounds right, and the size of galaxies right is really time consuming. That's where you just need to sit and run it literally hundreds of times with different settings, colour scales, contrast parameters, and frankly pick the best one. Pick the one that you think demonstrates the science point that you're trying to get across. There's so much information in whether you're looking at simulations or whether you're looking at data. There are very, very different questions. There are hundreds of papers that have been written on that image that I've shown you. Everything from studies of very, very nearby galaxies, where that's all you're interested in, to studies of some of the most distant galaxies, where that's the most interested in. And depending on what science question you're asking, if you're trying to make an animation, that will dictate will dictate how you make that movie look. There isn't a one size fits all. If you're interested in these foreground galaxies here, you want to optimize your color scale or your depth or your size of galaxies to highlight their properties, their structure. If you're interested in the most distant objects, you forfeit the information in the foreground objects in order to enhance the contrast of, say, the very most distant objects. Making these movies is relatively easy. doing the, running the movie hundreds and hundreds of times with lots and lots of different settings and trying to pick the best, whatever best is, best one. That's where it takes all the time. That's why it's a great student project in the summer, because they have loads of time.
But in some senses, what you're talking about is almost like drawing something. So if you have something in front of you, all three of us would draw it in a different way, and it puts me in mind. I was based at the British School at Rome for a while on a fellowship there, and I met an archaeological draftsperson. So she was an illustrator of archaeological finds, and I was really fascinated by this because it seemed so anachronistic. And I said, well, why don't they just take photographs of what they find? And she said, because I am interpreting what is important in terms of the archaeological detail of this. So it's not necessarily a representation of the object, it's a representation of what is important in that object. And it's like, she could maybe be given instructions to think about different things that would produce different drawings from that, even though you had the actual object in front of you. So there are kind of parallels in those creative decision making. There is
again what you're trying to
creativity
capture
in what in the decisions that you're making alongside the science. The science gives you the parameters.
So in a sense what you're trying to do is capture the experience and what the object means rather than what the object actually is. Right? So I think that it's again one of those tricks that when you see a painting of something and you think, well, this is just a landscape painting, and you see the same scene, you realise, that tree isn't where it really is, but it's put there to enhance the overall composition and overall experience is from the painting can be much more like what it was like to be really there, even though the painting is not what was actually there in a possible way, right? And so again, it's the same kind of thing, trying to give you, well, we can't actually go and experience the galaxy, but trying to give you some hint of that, and to see much more. And then that kind of has an impact on the science, because it allows you to focus on the bits that are the interesting science aspects of this. So and I guess there are different target audiences that you can want to, that depending on what you want to achieve, what you want to discover from this, right?
Yeah, because I think in my sphere, there's this question of how do you make somebody connect to something? How do you make them care about something and have that relationship with it? So you talking about Ansel Adams' photographs, he was supremely good at making that connection between that person, even if you hadn't ever been to Yosemite. That there was a kind of sense of kind of presence and majesty, etc. And a technically very good kind of photograph within that. But one of the things which is always a really big question for me in my work is you're taking an image which is sort of taken from the world, you work with it, and then you have to kind of put it back out in the world, and you have to put it back out in a way that talks about the things that are important to me. So for me, one of the key things is how we connect to a photograph, how it just doesn't become a sort of visual thing or an intellectual thing, that it becomes a substantial physical thing that you encounter in space. And so it's always sort of problematic, this kind of relationship between seeing things on a screen or in a book and all sorts of different scales, because when I make a photograph and I put it in a space for somebody to encounter, it's really
part
specific.
Of the experience,
so the scale of it in relation to us is really important. The fact of how somebody might feel engulfed by something, that I always hang the photographs really low, so and often that makes people feel quite uncomfortable because they're used to seeing something appear as an image, and when it's lower down, it's you have this kind of bodily relationship to it. But also you know, some of the things are quite perverse. You know, I've photographed in complete darkness, you know, in a mine, and that photograph is really important to me, because people, you know, they're encountering this black space, but it's incredible what it does on a white wall. It just sucks all the light from around it. So it's a very, you know, it's a very particular kind of phenomenon that's happening. And people approach it and think, it's a photograph, I want to see an image, I want to get some meaning out of it, I need to know it's of a place, and it is of a place.
Well, that's, you know, what I love is,
but it's just of a place that has no light, you know, and it has the kind of basic parameters of photography that we usually expect taken away from it. But at the same time, it is this very physical object in space that you kind of encounter. So one of the things I was sort of thinking through with the work that you're doing here is how could we get people to connect to it through how they encounter it. Okay, so at the moment you're showing it on a screen, you know, you're showing it in a sort of educational setting, but you know, how could it be sort of installed in such a way that people have quite a different relationship to it, not necessarily just kind of wow sort of thing, but are actually, you know, engaging with some of these ideas in it, you know, that this idea that you are travelling through time as well as space, you know, that's an incredible thing to try and get your head around. And how do you get people to care about it, because we're sort of desensitized by all the CGI around. How is this not the start of Star Wars? Or
and something that is
that's right.
No, well, the problem I always come across is, you know, you make an image like this, and you know what I care about in that image is that it is the real thing, well, nearly. And yet you could make an image which kind of looks like that, but it wouldn't bear any relation to the true physics of the universe. And how to capture that part of why I care about that image is incredibly hard, right? It's I have no idea how you impress upon people, look, this is the way things really are. It's not something that's just from my imagination of how they might be, like you might see in Star Wars, but it's the best representation I can do of when you look out of the window on the dark night and you look up into the night sky. That's what you're really seeing. Okay, you can't see it because it's dark matter, or it's the light is emitted at wavelengths your eyes can't see, but that's what you're really seeing up there. Your human capacity to experience is limited, but because of the computer, I can give you the capacity to see what's really there. And that's not Star Wars, right? Star Wars is just some big spectacular explosion that looks cool. It can look very cool, but there is a difference to what I like to achieve. Now, how you achieve that and differentiate it from Star Wars, I don't know, right? Other than telling people, no, this really is the what the universe is maybe really
but
like.
Telling people,
but that's cheating, right? That's you know.
Because I think that maybe some of this could be approached through things that we kind of wrestle with in the arts, and often it's about the failure of something. So whenever I talk about my work, I often say I'm really interested in the failure of photography, what it actually can't do. And people get very upset and start sort of bristling because they want you to be a kind of an advocate for it and basically do everything. But actually sometimes when we think about those points where it can't do something, that it can't actually give you a sort of sense of phenomenological experience. So the spaces that I'm often photographing in are incredibly powerful in that kind of phenomenological sense. But how does the photograph actually deal with that? And I think often the problem is with CGI, with VR, there's this kind of all-encompassing hermetic world that's created, that there is no failure in it, there is no doubt in it, there is no uncertainty. But right at the heart of everything that you're doing is this massive uncertainty. You know,
exactly.
and this fact that you're all involved in this search for this 95 or 4 or 6% of the universe that is actually missing, absent, you know, imperceptible, is really interesting conceptually. You know, that there's this kind of doubt at the core of it. So how does that figure in how you construct images of it, models of it, and you know, how are we placed in relation to it? Because again, when we sort of fly through, one of the questions that I was asking you last time we spoke was, where are we positioned? Because you know, what I've just described to you as an encounter with my photograph is about pulling us back to our own sort of sense of scale and that kind of felt thing. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to kind of deal with. So I'm interested in terms of these visualizations, because this idea of kind of going around, you talk about being in a spacecraft, but it's a real kind of disembodied experience.
Well, it is at the moment. I mean, that's one of the failures, right? A really good photograph of the castle, the glen, would also give you the mist, and you know, you'd be shivering there in your raincoat and watching the waves of rain going past and feeling the cold reality of the world. And you would get that feeling by looking at the photograph, and it would manage to capture that in the photograph. Now, so the challenge is to kind of almost be able to be in the space to the level of reality of being able to taste the hydrogen, to taste the carbon that's floating past in the universe past you. I have no idea how you actually achieve that in a photograph of something that doesn't exist. But that would be the aim of it, would be to give you those impressions. And the only way you can try and do that is to kind of cue into your experiences on Earth, right? Your actual human experience. But can you give enough keys in this, you know, distant, remote world that you can translate the way you feel on Earth into how you really feel in this view of the universe as you float through it? And maybe I don't want to be in a hermetically sealed spacecraft. I want an open-top sports car. Or sportscraft, perhaps I should say, right? With which I can press a button and fly around the universe with the wind ruffling my hair. And that would be the experience that we really want of the universe, right? Because it's impossible, but let's not let that stop us, right? So that would be the ideal thing, to be able to interact with the universe at that level.
But it's fascinating, because at the heart of it there is that conceptual, you know, contradiction that really you're talking about making an experiential approximation of something that we'll never ever experience.
Exactly. And if we go back and remember, what I'm really using is some numbers in the big black box we went to see last time, right? So in some sense it is the ultimate CGI. It is just numbers out of the box. But the reason I care more, it is real, or I believe it's real, and I want other people to care about this as well. It's just we can go beyond our human faculty to perceive much more about the universe that there really is.